Welcome students. This presentation is about the Sustainable Development Goals. In the following I will give you an overview of these goals which have been adopted by most countries in the world. Let's start with a brief overview of the history of the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, the Sustainable Development Goals are only the most recent step in a long-term effort of the member states of the United Nations to shift the world onto a more sustainable development path. The formal start of these intergovernmental efforts began with the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, in Sweden in the year 1972. That was the first global conference on the environment and development, and it first acknowledged conflicts between environment and development. At the same time, a very influential report was published with the title Limits to Growth, which was commissioned by the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is a think tank which performs research and advocacy on the world economic system, environmental degradation, and other topics. The report Limits to Growth that was published in the year 1972 was a scenario analysis of 12 possible future scenarios of the world from the year 1972 to the year 2100. It was actually a computer simulation of these possible future scenarios. One of its main conclusions was that if the growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production and resource depletion continue unchanged, that then the limits of growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The report further said that the most likely consequence of reaching these limits will be an uncontrollable decline in population and industrial capacity. So it was a very pessimistic outlook for the future of our planet. In the year 1982, the General Assembly of the United Nations initiated the so-called World Commission on Environment and Development. The informal name of this commission was Brundtland Commission, named after the former Norwegian Prime Minister Brundtland, who served as the chair of the commission. The Brundtland Commission's mandate was to re-examine the critical issues of environment and development and to propose ways to deal with these issues. In the year 1987, the Brundtland Commission published its famous report, Our Common Future, which is also known as the Brundtland Report. The Brundtland Report recognized that environmental limits to economic growth exist and introduced the concept of sustainable development as a possible solution. The report was very influential because it placed environmental issues firmly on the political agenda. One of the most important achievements of the Brundtland Report was that it viewed environment and development not as two separate topics, but as one single issue. And it furthermore introduced a definition of sustainable development, which you already know from our previous class. It said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In 1992, the United Nations organized a conference in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the so-called United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which is also informally known as the Earth Summit. The governments of 172 countries participated in this conference, with 116 governments sending their heads of state or government. Furthermore, some 2,400 representatives of non-governmental organizations attended. The participants of this conference agreed to publish several documents, such as the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development and the Agenda 21. These documents are not legally binding, but they turned out to be very influential with regards to sustainable development policies. The Agenda 21, for example, is a voluntary action plan with regard to sustainable development. In the years after 1992, many countries adopted this action plan in their national environmental policies. In addition to agreeing on such voluntary action plans, the United Nations also opened important legally binding agreements for signature, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. 20 years later, in the year 2012, the United Nations organized another conference in Rio de Janeiro, the so-called United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which is also informally known as Rio Plus 20. The leaders of 192 governments worldwide participated in this conference, and they took stock of what had been achieved by that time towards the progress to sustainable development. The major conclusions that they made were that the diagnosis made back in the year 1972 at that first UN conference was still fundamentally correct. That combining economic growth with environmental sustainability was a challenge that was not well addressed and a problem that was getting worse. And second, that the major actions that were agreed upon at the UN conference in 1992 had not been successful in the end at solving these problems. They found that there were still ongoing and unresolved problems like climate change, an ongoing loss of biodiversity, and many other environmental problems. In order to address these remaining environmental problems, Rio Plus 20 resulted in the non-binding document The Future We Want, which supports the development of Sustainable Development Goals. It's interesting to know that the Sustainable Development Goals were not the first global development goals of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations had already developed another set of development goals in the year 2000, the so-called Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals are 8 international development goals that were established and adopted by 189 UN member countries following the Millennium Summit of the United Nations in the year 2000. That Millennium Summit was another UN conference which did not focus exclusively on environmental issues, but more on overall human development. The 8 international development goals that were adopted at that time, the so-called Millennium Development Goals, were to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, to promote gender equality and empower women, to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health, to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, to ensure environmental sustainability, and to develop and implement a global partnership for development. And these 8 Millennium Development Goals were planned to be achieved by the end of the year 2015. The progress towards reaching these Millennium Development Goals has been very uneven across countries and goals. That means that some of these goals were achieved, some of the goals were not achieved. Some of the goals were achieved in specific countries, while other countries failed to achieve these goals. Take, for example, goal number 1. Goal number 1 was to eradicate extreme hunger and poverty. And there was a specific target that said that between the years 1990 and 2015, the proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day should be reduced by 50%. Some of the UN member states were successful in achieving these goals. For example, China. China has seen tremendous economic growth and it has lifted millions of people out of poverty, thus achieving this first goal of the Millennium Development Goals. But there are other countries who did not achieve these goals, including many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's come back to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are a set of 17 goals with 169 associated targets that were adopted in the UN Sustainable Development Summit in September 2015. So you can see that it took quite some time. It took more than 3 years, from 2012, when the Sustainable Development Goals were first proposed, to 2015, when they were finally adopted in New York. The Sustainable Development Goals have one overall objective, and that is to guide rich and poor countries in their pursuit of sustainable development, generating new power and political will, and mobilizing new resources. So, the major purpose of these goals is to give countries and governments worldwide an idea of what they can do in order to achieve sustainable development in their countries. And when you have such global goals adopted by all UN member states, that usually generates a lot of power and political will. So political leaders across the world are willing to implement these goals in their own countries. And it also usually mobilizes new resources like social resources and academic resources. For academic resources, we can say that researchers at universities or at independent research institutes usually orient themselves using global goals of the United Nations, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, when they design their research and also when they ask for financial support from donors. So let's quickly go through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 1 is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. You can see that this picks up where the Millennium Development Goals have ended. Remember that Goal 1 of the Millennium Development Goals was to reduce poverty by 50%. Now the Sustainable Development Goals are even more ambitious, saying that poverty should be ended in all its forms everywhere. What you can see already here is that the Sustainable Development Goals do not only address environmental issues, but also more broad human development issues. However, as you will see, as we go through the different goals, environmental issues have a much larger emphasis here than in the Millennium Development Goals. Goal number 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Goal 2 is partly similar to goal number 1 as it talks about basic needs of people. Ending poverty, like ending hunger, giving people enough to eat and enable them to have a good nutrition. But it also talks about sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture, on the one hand, is important because it should be sustainable in a way that it gives people food over a long period of time. But sustainable development, sustainable agriculture, is also very much related to environmental issues, because sustainable agriculture is agriculture which reduces environmental degradation. Usually we have a lot of negative effects of agriculture on the environment, like having chemical pesticides used and so on. And sustainable agriculture tries to reduce that, thereby having a positive effect both on the environment, but also, of course, on ending hunger and achieving food security, because it should still be able to give people enough to eat. Goal number 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. So this goal emphasizes the need for health in our populations. Goal number 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So education is the clear focus of this goal. And goal number 5 is to achieve gender equality and to empower all women and girls. So this is about giving women and girls the same opportunities that men and boys have in their lives in general, in their education, in their opportunity to find a well-paid job, and so on. Goal number 6 is to ensure the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. As you know, water is restricted. The availability of water is limited in many countries, including Thailand. So this goal focuses on giving people access to enough and to clean water, and also to sanitation. Goal number 7 is to ensure the access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. This again touches both human development issues and environmental issues. One target of this goal is to give people access to energy, to enough energy. And this is not always possible. Many countries do face the problem of energy poverty, like not having access to electricity, for example. Another aspect of this goal is the environmental aspect, as it talks about sustainable energy. And this relates to the use of clean energy sources, like solar energy, for example, as opposed to dirty energy sources such as coal, which are having a negative effect on the environment. Goal number 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. This goal is quite interesting because, as you can see, the Sustainable Development Goals also acknowledge the importance of the economy for our societies, as they emphasize the need for having economic development and the need for providing enough employment opportunities for our populations. Goal number 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and to foster innovation. Again, this goal focuses on the economic sector of our society. And goal number 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. This takes into account the importance to include everyone in our development. In many countries, we have certain parts of our populations which are not as rich and which do not have access to all of those goods and services that other people have. So goal number 10 is to really reduce that inequality between poor and rich people, both within but also between different countries. Goal 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. This relates to the fact that more and more people in our societies are living in urban areas, in towns or in big cities like in Bangkok. And these urban areas have their own special environmental problems, like air pollution, for example. And we can reduce air pollution in urban areas, for example, by using more sustainable ways of transport. You know that many people need to be transported in a big city, and many people are using a car to go from their start to their destination. By replacing some of these cars by using public transport, we can reduce air pollution and therefore have a more sustainable development in urban areas. Goal 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Many environmental problems are specifically related to the consumption and production of goods and services. If you go to a supermarket, many times you will use a plastic bag in order to pack all the things that you have bought and bring them to your home. We can avoid that. We can stop using plastic bags, thereby reducing environmental waste which is created. So ensuring a sustainable consumption and production is a very important goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. Climate change is an issue I'm sure you all have heard about already. Climate is changing worldwide. We see rising temperatures in general, and we see also a higher frequency and severity of extreme weather events. There are more strong storms in countries. There are stronger droughts in countries. We see more floodings, as you have also witnessed, for example, in Thailand a couple of years ago. And this is a very important global challenge, the combat of climate change and its impact. Goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Oceans or water in general cover more than 2/3 of the Earth's surface. So obviously a lot of the pollution that development generates will affect these 2/3 of our Earth, the oceans, sea and marine resources. And goal number 14 aims at conserving and using these water resources in a sustainable manner. Goal 15 is to protect, restore and promote the sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. As you can see, this goal includes several different smaller goals. Take, for example, the sustainable management of forests. Forests are a very important part of our environment because forests provide us with so-called forest ecosystem services. We can use forests because they give us wood that we use to produce furniture, to produce paper, or to construct houses. Forests also regulate our global climate, so they are an important part of our effort to control global climate change. Land degradation, so halting and reverting land degradation, is also one of these smaller goals. Land degradation is basically the loss of productivity of different types of land. And this has a lot to do with agricultural production. In agriculture, many times we use chemical pesticides and fertilizers to increase agricultural productivity. But these chemical products do have a negative effect on the soil, of the quality of our land, because they degrade the land. So that means that in the future, our land will be less productive than it is now because we are increasing production now by using these chemical inputs. This has also, again, a lot to do with sustainable agriculture, which would be a way to reduce the use of chemical products in agriculture production, thereby possibly reducing land degradation. And another goal that is included in this goal 15 is halting of biodiversity loss. Biodiversity is basically the diversity of all life on Earth. So that includes humans, that includes animals, that includes plants, even bacteria and viruses. And the goal here is to reduce the loss of biodiversity because many species of plants and animals have been extinguished in the last 100 years and more. And there's an increasing and ongoing trend of biodiversity loss. And we want to stop that because we acknowledge the value of biodiversity. Some of the species of plants are very important for us because they provide us with important ecosystem services that increase our well-being. So goal 15 is a goal that includes all these different types of targets. Goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. This means that we want to have access for everyone in our society to the same types of services that are, for example, provided by the government. We want everyone to have a good access to health services, but also we want everyone to have access to justice. Goal 17 is to strengthen the means of implementation and to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. This relates to the need to really have a global effort to achieve all these sustainable development goals. Many environmental problems that we face today are global problems, and many times it is easier to solve these problems if countries work together.